It's a question that comes up a lot.
Why does God allow suffering?
Why does God allow suffering? Yeah.
We've got 55 seconds.
No problem.
How do you answer a question if someone asks you, if there is a God, why is there so much suffering in the world?
If God is all good and all powerful and all knowing, why does he allow bad things to happen to good people?
How can one claim that God is loving in God's providence when he allows this level of affliction to the person?
Why do we have so much suffering in the world today?
Why wouldn't he then design the universe purportedly so asteroids wouldn't kill us or so that we wouldn't get cancer and die?
Perhaps more than any other, suffering is an experience that defines our relationship to the world. Its counterpoint, joy, is always fleeting. It seems to go more than it comes on. Many of us pass our whole lives feeling the weight of joy's absence, a condition that may best be defined as suffering. The sense that something is missing. The sense that we're not whole. So for many of us, our entire lives are spent in various states of suffering. We're either feeling it keenly, immediately, having it rupture the very ground on which we stand, or we're waving it away, riding around on whatever unique blend of compulsive behaviours allow us to escape it, moment to moment. But like a person hopping from foot to foot on hot coals, suffering is never escaped from. Not really. It is a condition of being alive. It is, perhaps, the condition. But there are a number of category errors here. The assumption of consensus. To answer the question why God allows suffering, we must first determine what is meant by the word God, and allows, and suffering. Let's start with suffering. If I see the totality of my being as being myself, if it is my own sense of self-identity, my ego which constitutes the ground and the source of reality, if I see myself as the centre of the universe, which all my senses seem literally to confirm, then of course anything that causes me to suffer is a problem. For in this way, pain, suffering represent a threat to the universe entire. But if I identify with the pure field of awareness that is behind my ego, then that self-same ego is revealed to no longer be the source of being. In this way, all the pain, all the suffering experienced by my ego are no more threatening to myself than are ripples on the surface a threat to the ocean. It may be useful here to make a distinction between suffering and pain. Swiss philosopher and historian John Gebser outlined 5 stages in the development of human consciousness. The first of these, the archaic structure, was that period prior to the proverbial fool. Archaic consciousness is zero-dimensional, in the sense of a total absence of differentiation. There is no subject-object polarity, let alone duality, no differentiation between self and other, between soul and nature, between the individual and the universe. In this primordial state of oneness, the condition of suffering, as we know it today, would not exist. Animals, for example, who were themselves never banished from the garden, who never fell, don't suffer in the way that we do. They feel pain, of course. Pain is a biological mechanism that enables survival, but for the most part, they don't suffer. Being a universal and unavoidable experience that as living beings we inevitably partake in, pain is something that would only bind us closer to others, and to nature. Suffering, meanwhile, depends on the ability to metacognize, to be able to both feel pain and then observe, I am feeling pain. Only when this happens, when we identify with pain, when we call it my pain, can suffering start. Instead of taking us out of ourselves, it drags us further in. Our pain pulls us to a place where we are alone. In our agony, we are isolated from others and from the world. The films of Ukrainian director Yurii Illienko are all about this splitting, both in the sense of his characters being cut off from the world, but also in the psychic sense, in the way that he presents the world to his audience. Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors is his first major work. Made with fellow filmmaker Sergei Parajanov, it differs so wildly from the latter's later films that it feels appropriate to describe it as a collaboration, even though ostensibly Illienko here is the cinematographer. This opening sequence beautifully demonstrates the almost schizophrenic quality that would come to define his work. As film theorist Elizabeth A. Papazian writes, quote, "The mobile camera does not reveal a true continuous reality. It serves not to establish a sense of spatial and temporal continuity, but to plunge us into a sensual experience of form in which space and time are layered. The apparently long tracking shot that follows Ivan through the snow turns out to be illusory. The sequence is constructed to appear as a single long take, but actually consists of several shots spliced together, with abrupt pans and tilts into the snow and sky concealing the cuts. This creates a perceptual dislocation. The movement of the camera fails to reveal the spatiality of the village." End quote. This scene, right at the beginning of the film, represents a kind of birth. It's disorienting. The world Ivan is presented with is not comprehensible to him. It passes by in a series of flashes, of disconnected images and emotions. Reality has not yet settled into a single workable arena through which to navigate. The process of Ivan's birth, like all births, is indeed a fool. Someone once said that with its cries, a baby, if it could, would bring down the entire universe. Like the walls of Jericho, powerless to withstand the might of 1,000 horns and drums, saying, "No, I don't want this, I want to go back. And lo, if I am already here, then here I will destroy instead." Because here, as the baby knows, and as it will see as it moves through life, is always a wrestling with God. Our instinctive desire to impress our own sense of self-identity on the world runs in parallel with that other side that wants to let go, that wants to be enfolded once more in the arms of the divine. But what does all this mean? What do we mean when we talk about God? Much, if not all, of suffering stems from a faulty conception of the word. In Western culture, God is a man with a white beard sitting on a cloud, a very real being in the material sense. He's fleshy, full of blood, with a working bladder, waiting to judge us when we die. Somewhere I think we took a wrong turn with all this. At some point, following the scientific revolutions of the 16th and 17th centuries, we began to try and fit the world of spirit into the emerging materialist paradigm. The problem is that it doesn't go. The scientific method grew out of a desire to understand the material world, the movement of planets, the processes of nature, humanity's place in a span of time stretching back to the birth of the universe. But the fathers of this revolution never anticipated or planned for it to become capable of explaining the totality of reality per se. As they knew, there are some things that science will never be able to understand. In the broad psychological sense, the marrying of church and state was a disaster. They're awkward bedfellows. They're not a match. And the breakdown in their marriage is what existential despair and the current crisis in mental health look like from our spiritually impoverished perspective. Because, as the ancient Greeks knew, there comes a point when logos must give way to mythos. Karen Armstrong, a professor of comparative religion, has written extensively on the importance of maintaining a sense of the sacred.
Myth has been defined as something that in some sense happened once, but which also happens all the time.
Yes.
It's expressing an eternal truth, not a historical one. And it is also intuitive rather than logical.
Yes.
Whereas the West was becoming more and more logical as we progressed scientifically, and that's been the source of our greatness in the world. But also, we've lost a sense of spirituality.
For many of the Eastern religious traditions, this is not a problem they had to contend with. By not reducing the idea of God to a single fixed image, a creator figure, they have not allowed the symbol to obscure what is symbolized. For Joseph Campbell, the image of the deity should remain transparent. Gods are metaphors transparent to transcendence, and my understanding of the mythological mode is that deities and even people are to be understood in this sense, as metaphors. It's a poetic understanding. It is to be understood in the same sense as Goethe's words at the end of Faust. Everything transitory is but a reference. As psychiatrist Stanislav Grof explains,
if you make an archetype, if you make a deity opaque, you cannot see beyond that, then you have basically idolatry, and then you have the danger that you divide the world, because there will be people who would focus on that particular archetypal domain and would get into a hostile relationship. So you need a situation where you get through the archetype to the source out of which everything comes. And this is something that you find in mystical branches. When the organized religions get into conflict and fights, the mystics don't have any problem. The mystical experiences are universal. They are all-encompassing. Everybody is included. They don't sort of alienate the world.
So instead of an omnipotent being sitting on his heavenly throne, a being up there, gods, spirits are to be approached as archetypes. They're symbolic representations of certain aspects of the psyche. God is merely an image representing the divine aspect that exists in every individual. It's no accident that Moses, Merlin, and Gandalf all have big white beards. They represent the Godhead, functioning in their stories in the same way that they function in the subjective psyche, as the psychopomp, or spiritual guide, our intuition, our conscience, the God within. So God is real. More. In this way, he is realer than real, a psychic, spiritual truth that exists above and beyond anything on the material plane. But the question remains, why then does he allow us to suffer? Or, as already discussed, if life is somehow synonymous with suffering, why are we here at all? In his film The Eve of Ivan Kupalo, Illienko presents us with a world filled with animals, plants and bonfires. Fireflies are everywhere. A priest is made to climb a tree and say, "Cuckoo, cuckoo." There is a cockfight. The mood switches abruptly from the pastoral to the phantasmagoric and back. Bodies float about, lean at odd angles, disappear and reappear in somewhat different incarnations only to vanish again. Is that a delegation from the court of Louis XIV? Are you watching the real characters, or are they shades or creatures from somebody's dream? The lovers age and grow young again. He showers himself in gold that falls like autumn leaves. And in what must represent an episode from Ukrainian history, she runs and runs, bearing his ashes and being pursued by a Mongol horde. Seasons come and go, and the screen itself changes complexion. Is that a forest in stained glass? There are queer screechings, atonality prevails. well before the young folks get married and set off in a garlanded rowboat for a trip down the Dnieper, you may find yourself at sea. What sense is there to be made of all of this? In a short book written towards the end of his life, psychologist C.G. Jung attempted to answer this question. Answer to Job is a response to the events in the book of Job. In this biblical story, God enters into a bet with the devil. Up until then, the devil argues, Job had been one of God's most loyal followers, not because he necessarily was good and just, but because it served his own interests to be so. He was a rich man with a large, healthy family and a wife whom he loved. Of course he abided by God's laws. They had brought him everything good in life. And so gradually the devil pulls Job's life apart, taking his wealth, his house, then killing his children. Eventually Job is left with nothing. His problems mount up, one upon the other, until he is a broken man with no family, no home, his body beset with excruciating boils. As philosopher Bernardo Kastrup explains,
Job confronts God with it and says, I'm a righteous man. I did nothing wrong. Why are you inflicting all this punishment on me? My children have died. I don't have my sheep anymore. I'm not healthy anymore. I'm poor. It's tragedy after tragedy. Why do I deserve this? And once he confronts God, God goes on a tirade saying, I am the power behind the storms. And he doesn't actually answer the question. Jung basically analyzes Yahweh, the God of the Old Testament, and says he was incapable of self-reflection. As Jung put it, he was omniscient, but he didn't know how to consult his omniscience. Perhaps this is what man can contribute to God. The word man here is sexist, but I will stick to his style of back in the 50s. What man can contribute to God is that man is small in front of the monstrousness of the world. So he regularly is stopped on his feet because of his weakness. And he's forced to contemplate himself, and contemplate the world and ask the deeper questions and become self-reflective and meta-conscious to, for instance, ponder the implications of his actions or the actions of nature, the actions of God, the actions of the world, and think through them deeply. And God doesn't need to do any of this because God is the Almighty. He is never stopped on his tracks and forced to self-reflect, forced to contemplate what's going on. So man is what enables the self-reflectiveness of God. It is through man's eyes that God becomes more conscious. And this, in religious metaphor, of course, this single-handedly restores meaning to human life.
So by turning the story on its head, Jung presents us not with an all-powerful creator, sadistically maneuvering his creations through unimaginable suffering just for the sake of it. No, the story becomes reflexive. Through Job's suffering, God begins to know himself. In short, this is the purpose of human life. For Rupert Spira, a teacher in the non-dual tradition of Advaita Vedanta, the word God is altogether unnecessary.
Infinite consciousness can only know infinite consciousness. The infinite cannot know the finite directly. So, in order for there to be manifestation, in order for a world to be known, or an object to be known, infinite consciousness must forget that it is infinite consciousness. It must localize, or at least seem to localize itself as an apparently separate subject of experience, from whose perspective it is able to know an apparently separate object of experience. So this localizing of itself in the form of the finite mind is the mechanism by which form is known, by which consciousness's inherent formlessness appears as form. But consciousness can only know form through this localized or limited perspective of the finite mind, the apparently separate subject of experience. Now, the finite mind doesn't realize that it is a temporary localization or an apparent limitation of infinite consciousness. It believes that it is a self-existing finite mind. It doesn't realize that it is a localization of the infinite. In other words, it thinks that it's finite, temporary.
So it is perspective that enables that part of the psyche, the highest part, to learn about itself. As humans, we are part of an ever-evolving inquiry into the nature of experience itself. And the sufferings of our supposed selves, that with which we identify for the duration of our lives, are offered up to the divine so that it might know itself better. Our strifes are gift from some small beings, natives of this special hell we create for ourselves, beings nonetheless strong enough to hold it together, broken in some way, always broken, but always emerging back into the light, saying always, here we are, still here, still alive, ready to suffer more. There's a story about the therapist Marie-Louise von Franz and one of her patients. This woman had been coming to see the famed Jungian analyst for years. She had severe schizophrenia, and her suffering was such that she told von Franz, "What is the meaning of my life? I am ruined. Even the medication isn't helping me anymore. What meaning can you give to my life?" Von Franz replied simply, "You are suffering for God."